overseas, was educated in New York, went back to Afghanistan to be trained, came back here. He and 3 others were planning a liquid explosive attack that came within hours of succeeding in 2009. That would have made 9/11 look less than it was. There would have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people would have been killed. Then we had to observe what was happening overseas. We saw the bombings on the London subways. We had to then try to adapt here in this country how we would counter that. We saw the Mumbai attack, where we saw using fire as a weapon. These were all things we were doing. No one at that time was minimizing any attack by domestic terrorists. But we had to, I believe, answer the message that was sent to us by the Congress, by the President of both administrations of combating terrorism. We had Secretary Napolitano coming up to brief us, and Secretary Jay Johnson coming up. 99% of what they told us was about Islamist fundamentalist terrorism from overseas being directed here. Now, one of the reasons why when people say in the last several years there's been more people killed by domestic terrorists rather than by international terrorists, one of the reasons for that is we've been successful. We have set up defenses. We do have them on the run. And it's under both administrations. I'm not trying to make this a partisan issue at all. We work together. And I think it does injustice to this committee, and it does injustice what we're trying to do by somehow saying because this committee didn't work on and did not have hearings exclusively on domestic terrorism that we didn't care about. That's like saying somebody who's in a burglary squad doesn't care about rape, or somebody in a homicide squad doesn't care about bank robberies. We had our lane, and we were told what we had to do. It was the Judiciary Committee, which had prime jurisdiction over the issue of domestic terrorism. The other ones who had prime jurisdiction over the FBI. We actually have no real jurisdiction over the FBI. We had to fight hard enough to get what we have. So, Mr. Chairman, all I'm saying is, listen, I fully support these hearings. We're at a stage now where this is a new threat, an evolving threat, a more sophisticated threat, and this is a very important hearing to have on domestic terrorism. But somehow to say that people didn't care about it before and didn't care about the loss of human life and didn't care about the victims of that and their families is wrong. It's in Justice Committee, and I take strong exception to it, Mr. Chairman, especially when you were chairman and did nothing on it yourself.
Gentleman from New York, finished?
I'm finished.
Well, let me just, for the record, indicate that the briefings that we started under my committee. I assure you that we'll continue to address any form of terrorism, international, domestic. The hearing today is to talk about domestic terrorism, how it looked, what the departments are doing to combat it, and that's why our witnesses are presenting the testimony here today. So at this point, we'll go forward and we'll ask the questions, but the goal is to find out what domestic terrorism in the unit is to do. And as long as I'm chair, we'll do just that.
Mr. Chairman, would yield on
that? We'll get back to you. We'll now recognize the gentleman.
As we confront domestic terrorism is the ease and speed with which the racist, misogynist, and other extremist ideologies that can fuel terrorism are spread online. In March, representatives from social media companies briefed members of this committee on online extremism. And while I appreciated their willingness to join the conversation, I was frankly really disappointed by how unprepared they were to provide sufficient answers in that briefing. Online, they may not have uniform community standards or adequate content reviewing processes or good information sharing with law enforcement. So my first questions are to the whole panel. How can social media companies like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter improve their efforts to work with your agencies to counter domestic terrorism, and what are they doing right and what needs to get better? We can start with Mr. Murphy. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Media companies to continue to police their websites. I think we've seen some fruit of that by working with them. And I think those efforts are ongoing, and we welcome a continual dialogue with the social media companies to continue to improve upon that process.
So you think that the level of engagement is sufficient?
So the department is engaging with the social media company.
Sure. So we obviously have very robust engagement with the social media companies, both as a training platform, where we will go out and we will give briefings on international terrorism and domestic terrorism, as we do with many of our private sector partners, banks, online companies, shippers, anything that there could be a tripwire that could help really to inform people for the see something, say something strategy. So we certainly do that, and we're very robust with that we will go through the U.S. Attorney's Office or through a national security letter on the on the international terrorism side to do a process, a legal process to request records and content, whether it's a search warrant or.
When we're talking about extremist content online, the First Amendment does impose some significant constraints. We can't initiate, even if a social media company was to report to us, this terrorist has put a manifesto, or this person has put up a thing criticizing various ethnic groups or whatever online. That's not something that we can initiate to us. Extremist content online doesn't necessarily give us the basis to initiate investigative activity.
And in your perspective, how would you compare social media companies' ability to respond to foreign terrorist threats to their ability to respond domestically? Would you say that they're equal, more or less?
The self-regulation of their term of use agreements, they've gotten much better. I will say on the domestic terrorism side, I will see that there's likely going to be an increase on there's a learning curve there as to what the social media companies have to do. I can tell you it appears, and this is open source, that they're hiring a lot of retired analyst agents, detectives to do that. And so that's a good thing that they're doing that now. And it will just take time, I think, with this evolving threat on both the homegrown violent extremist threat and the domestic terrorism threat here in the U.S., that they'll do the same on that.
Thank you. Facebook recently announced that it would begin redirecting users who search for white supremacist terms to an anti-extremism organization called Life After Hate, based in my home state of Illinois. Life After Hate is one of the only organizations in 2017, and it's never replaced it. And Facebook alone has over 2 billion users, and Life After Hate is one of the relatively small organizations. And so with this cut in funding, this organization cannot be expected to neutralize every neo-Nazi on the internet. Did any of your agencies or departments engage with Life After Hate following?
I'm not aware that we did.
And the others?
Ma'am, we'll have to get back to you. I'm not sure.
Okay. We know that domestic terror incidents related to white supremacists are on the rise. We know that Congress is willing to fully resource DHS. I've only been here a few months, and I've already voted to increase funding for the agency. But resources in a transparent way, American lives depend on it. Mr. Chairman, I'm looking forward to working with you and other colleagues on this committee to make sure that happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there was a time when our government, specifically even the DOJ, and as a pastor for 16 years, even the church looked the other way at some of the atrocities from some of these hate crimes and the terrorist activity that we saw has made great strides in stamping out this bigotry and these racist thugs and the damage that they would try and do. And I would hope that you know, and fellow members, that we will stand arm in arm with you when we see this, whether there's a 17% increase or a 17% decrease. My first question for Mr. Wigman is, how does your agency define a hate crime when prosecuting one of these cases?
Thank you for that question. I actually have the definition of hate crime here that Congress has provided in the federal code.
If it's less than 15, 20 seconds, I'd like to hear it.
Okay, I'll try to read it quickly. This is in section 249. To any person because of the actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin of any person. So causing violence to people on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin is essentially what a hate crime is.
Based on the definition that you just gave, I want to give you an example from this week. Brian Sims, a Pennsylvania state representative, verbally $100 if somebody would give up their names to be able to embarrass them, to trash them. Would you say that would fall under a hate crime?
I'd have to all the facts. I'm just reluctant to comment on any particular fact.
Well, so even the facts that I gave you just there, you don't want to comment on them today?
Just really reluctant, particularly if there is.
Draw the line between the right to assemble, protected by the U.S. Constitution, and the investigation or prosecution of a case as domestic terrorism.
So people have the right to assemble, petition, march in support of a particular cause, whether it's one that people generally find popular or not. That's something they can do. What they can't do is cross the line over into violence. And so the line that we draw and the FBI draws is you're free to assemble, you're free to petition your government.
So you can say pretty much anything. In the case of Mr. Sims, he said, "Bring it, Bible bullies," online. He tweeted this. You respect is what you're saying.
You can say a lot of things that most people in this room would find repulsive and inappropriate, repugnant, but unless you're crossing that line over into either a threat If it's a threat, that can be prosecuted. We have a number of threat statutes, or unless you're intending to incite violence, as the Supreme Court has defined the line on that.
So basically, people are okay to say something stupid. Check our Facebook pages if you need any evidence of that, terrorism.
Thank you for that question, sir. So we have several roles in the department. One of them is to work with our state and local colleagues to make sure that they have all the information they need at that level. They're the closest ones to the fight against domestic terrorism, and we work every day to provide them that information.
Okay. Have you seen an increase, decrease, or about the same number of resources from your agency being devoted to domestic terrorism over the last, let's say, the last decade?
Aspect of things.
And what is the process like that for your agency to be able to share that information?
So right now, one of the ways in which we do it, there's not just one way. We work with all our partners here at this table, but for the department, we look at what I described earlier, HIS and Intel, which is an intelligence sharing platform for law enforcement. We take the metrics we put on there very seriously. We continue to evaluate those numbers. And as I stated earlier, our number of products we're sharing is up by 64%. And the quality, they're soaring, quite frankly, around 325% increase and 90% approval rating of the products put out there.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan.
Intelligence side, we're seeing an increase in domestic terrorism. Can you explain to me why, based on your analysis?
So, ma'am, I think I'd answer the question this way. We look continually for threats of violence. We continue to readjust how those threats of violence manifest themselves in the homeland. Part of our efforts have looked at that agile nature of which homegrown vests. So as we've been more targeted in the way we do it, we've seen our numbers in terms of those that could be acting on violence increase. We refer those leads over for investigation to state and local law enforcement and the FBI.
So just so I understand, then your answer is you're looking harder, so you're finding more.
Cycle. Part of that has been explained by myself and others here in terms of how the internet has been a major factor in all threats of violence and the ability of adversaries to talk to each other over the internet, anonymously sometimes, and avoid those face-to-face meetings. And as that has changed society writ large, we've adjusted to that.
In domestic terrorism, from the advent of the internet to today, do we see a straight line in an increase in domestic terrorism? Mr. McGarity, why don't you take this one? Or has it been, I'm just trying to be honest here about the nature of the threat. I think you guys have done a phenomenal job on preventing another foreign terrorist attack. I think we have to give you guys a ton of credit. Has it been continuous since the advent of the internet, or is there other factors? Has it been precipitous in the past few years?
I can speak back to the internet, but I think that's a good question to look at. What I can speak to, if you look at points in time as far as our case numbers now, I gave a number of 850, and if you just look 6 months ago, we're actually down in cases, but cases are a point in time, right? We can literally open and close cases every day, so it's 2 data points, but certainly domestic terrorism side and the international terrorism side with homegrown violent extremists, that velocity is much quicker than it's ever been before. Now, Mr. Murphy and I spoke before about the insular nature and the internet. When you can go on the internet and find content that justifies what you want to do, your specific ideology, whatever that ideology is, that and the ability not to have to travel to meet someone, not to have to go into a group setting. First, it makes it harder for us to detect, to conspire, to commit an attack. You're finding the ideology, you're radicalizing fairly quickly, quicker than we've seen before, certainly years ago, even before 9/11 or after when we saw the foreign fighters. And on the domestic terrorism side, that mobilization of violence is much quicker.
Mm-hmm. So you said you had 850 cases that were open, and I understand they're just a spot check in the at a moment in time. How many of those cases are white supremacists?
Half are anti-government, anti-authority. Another 40% are racially motivated violent extremist cases. So 40% of the 850. Within that, a majority, but it's a significant majority, are racially motivated extremists who support the superiority of the white race.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And 2,000 are focused on domestic terrorism. Is that figure right, wrong? Please correct me if I have that wrong.
So again, I'm going to put it in a different way, but I think it answers your question. If you look at the way we are set up on our counterterrorism, our agents in the field and our agents at headquarters. Our agents in the field, it's about an 80-20 split as far as the number of cases in international terrorism. So 80% of those cases we work are international terrorism cases, which includes homegrown violent extremists, which are about 1,000. And I gave you a number of 850. If you look, the agents in the field marry up about 80%, 20% as to our case ratios, and then but that marries up almost exactly to the number of cases we have in the field as international terrorism and domestic terrorism. Back at headquarters, we have an entire section for domestic terrorism operations section, just like we do an international terrorism operations section in the homeland. They're both sections, equal sections. We have an analyst, and then we use our human section, everything else to augment that. But we are set up, we are mirrored right now in our domestic terrorism operations section to do the same work we do as our international terrorism operations section, absent the laws that we're allowed to do different things for international terrorism.
I'm happy to go by the clock if you want me to go by the clock, but I think it's expired. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you. Important hearing, and I'm finding the questions very fair and bipartisan and focused on the issue at hand, and that certainly comes from the example set by leadership here. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Gentlemen, thank you for your service to your country, your testimony today. Mr. McGarity, our research shows that the FBI currently has approximately 900 domestic terrorism investigations ongoing. Is that correct? Round number.
In hover, 850 right now, could be 850.
Number compared to investigations past, let's say a decade ago?
That I can't speak to, but we certainly can get that number and get it back to you.
Would you agree that the investigations into domestic terror has grown, though, at the FBI over the course of the last decade?
And see what
investigations into domestic terror?
We've always been set up to work domestic terrorism. We've always, obviously, the history will show we've worked it.
You believe there's a heightened awareness within the investigative community of the FBI?
I would say it's a very heightened
awareness. Okay, that's a fair statement. Would you agree? Of course, all of us are regarding some exit from the Joint Terrorism Task Forces nationwide. In my opinion, that's the front line of this mission to combat domestic terror, working with and sharing critical information with local law enforcement agencies as they conduct criminal investigations, which can lead, ultimately, recently certain jurisdictions have withdrawn from the Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Mr. McGarity, to what extent, in your opinion, does withdrawal from Joint Terrorism Task Force, how would that impact our ability as a nation, considering the relationship between local law enforcement, where these investigations commonly begin, and federal law enforcement? What's your opinion on how?
And what we've done over the last year since 9/11. Nothing the FBI does in the counterterrorism world we do alone. We do with partners. And those cases, I spoke about the referrals that we get. 50% of our referrals for our cases come in not only from state local partners, so whether on the JTTF or not, but from the public. And there's no one better than a state and local law enforcement officer that knows the public. So that information intake into the Joint Terrorism Task Force is crucial. Having membership there, nothing beats two people sitting side by side working a case. Nothing beats two people sitting side by side working a case together for a disruption as far as
predominantly African-American churches were burned to the ground, and that investigation was conducted with incredible professionalism by Louisiana State Fire Marshal and his team, working with local law enforcement and ultimately federal law enforcement. Fire Marshal Bush Browning did an amazing job leading the investigation. This initially began as an arson investigation. Then when the second church burned, of course, the team was on the ground. and the sharing of data at the local, state, and federal level was just an uplifting thing to behold, and ultimately the arrest was made, and the suspect was found to be involved in following pagan religion rituals of burning old. Again, Mr. McGarity, are there additional investigative or prosecutorial authorities needed to better address? Is there a piece of this puzzle that we're missing that this body can help you fill?
Department of Justice, and I know they're committed to working through possibilities. From my perspective, whether I'm working gangs, MS-13, or terrorism, any tool in the toolbox helps me when I'm looking at that threat every day as to what my options are and how I can disrupt that threat before an attack.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service and your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. A. Holland, my teacher, she taught us, oh, be some other name. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name smells semantics. And that's where I'd like for this conversation to go, if you will. In the FBI, in your report, there's a category of domestic terrorism called racially motivated violent extremism. And then it called black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement officers. Semantics. Extremist is Mr. McGarity.
So it's a term that we don't use, I haven't used in how we look at the threat since I've been here for the past 15 months. What it was is it's a term that came out from an effort to better define the threat that we saw specifically 2015, but specifically in July 2016, the July 7th, 2 attacks against law enforcement, and then the July 17th attack as well. It was a perspective, something where they saw a change, and the analysts attempt to highlight that change and analyze it. I can tell you, since I'm here, and I think your next part is that, why are we calling it racially motivated violent extremism? Because that's what we're focused on, is the violence. You know, everything's First Amendment protected right. You could be a white supremacist. I'm not going to investigate you because you have an ideology. I'm going to investigate you because you have an ideology that you're pursuing violence to attack others. That's where I'm going to investigate.
Okay. I grew up in a nation where we are not bitterly divided by, partisan politics and race and so forth. And so I appreciate your response, and that you don't use that term, but use race and instead of, for example, we don't say white supremacist extremism. We say racially motivated, and that is racially motivated violent extremism. I mean, in other words, we don't, and here we say racially motivated violent extremism, and so we leave out white supremacy, but then in identity extremists. I don't understand why we start with separating it.
So right now, I can tell you the way we're set up, the way we look at it, racially motivated violent extremism.
The 2017, it says black identity.
That was a report that was done, as I said, based upon the acts in 2016 to analyze a set of circumstances and events. I can tell you we don't use that term since I've been here, and we use the term racially motivated violent extremism, which is looking to push forward the supremacy of the white race, or if someone has a perceived injustice because of something, to use violence. So if we need to track numbers, we can do that, because we do need to understand the threat. But what I need to do is I need to train my task force officers, my analysts, my agents, that it's the violence we're focused on. And it's the violence, it's not the ideology. The ideology will likely get you to the violence and the hate, but we need to focus on the violence, and that's why we use the term we use now. And we've been using it for 15 months. I've had a conversation with members of Noble on the blacklist. Senior executives in charge of domestic terrorism speak at the Noble conference.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you. Continue this ongoing dialogue. Recently, members of this committee had the opportunity to hear representatives from social media. Their concerns were our concerns as well. They identify threats or acts of violence that are on their platforms that are being actively discussed. Do they proactively share this information with you? And what steps do you then take? Mr. McGarity, I'll ask you to address first, please.
I can't speak to every company, but certainly many of the major companies do give us leads, tips, when they see something, a full investigation or a preliminary investigation. I can't say they all do that. Now, there's certainly companies out there that don't, but we are seeing a tide change in social media companies being more proactive, policing their own, and when they see something, partly because they have retired law enforcement analysts in there, when they see something that is noteworthy and alarming beyond First Amendment, they will give us leads.
Can you quantitate that, Mr. McGarity? Can you see trends that you can share with us?
From where I sit on the threats we're working at, we do get leads coming in from some of the major social media companies. I haven't looked at the statistical analysis or trends, but it's certainly more than I'm sure we got in years past.
Is that something that would be easily quantitated? Is that something that you have the resources to do? And provide
something we could do. It's resources are obviously you're taking people off to do different things, but it's certainly something we can look at to see if it's possible, to see if it's something that's worth tracking.
Are there additional measures that you think the social media platforms should be dialoguing with you regarding that?
We are certainly training them on what the threats are when we talk about the international terrorism internally. We certainly educate people to the threat, whether they're a social media company or a bank or a shipping company.
You talked earlier about the radicalization and how easily that is to be obtained, that information on the internet. Do you think they are taking the appropriate response from the social media platforms in addressing this? With the education that you provide?
Exactly how much of their efforts that they are doing. I can tell you on open source, different companies have been more forthcoming in what they're producing as far as self-identifying content that's unacceptable. But I can't tell you exactly what they're doing inside the companies.
Mr. Murphy and Mr. Wigman, would you be interested in commenting to this as well?
I would say that the department in the last 2 years has looked at working with the major social media companies and through a coalition of the willing and others, which is largely known as the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. We do see that those efforts are environment.
Mr. Wigman.
I don't have anything further to add.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the young lady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member, Mr. Rogers, and I thank our panelists for bringing it. Has not set well with me, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain, because I understand the delicate balance between First Amendment rights and operationalizing things, but if it was brought to your knowledge that there was a manifesto online, is there a process that you have to sort of vet that? You made it sound as though, oh, anyone can print a manifesto and this is like a common practice. Can you give me a sense of exactly what you were saying?
Yeah. So I totally get your concern, because these online statements, as Mr. McGarity has explained, are exactly the kind of things that can lead people to radicalize and turn to violence. The challenge really lies in, and I'll just talk briefly about the First Amendment jurisprudence here. There's a famous Supreme Court case.
No, I don't want to go that far.
Oh,
I don't want you to go that deep.
Okay.
I'm saying you mentioned that if you saw a manifesto online, it is commonly viewed as freedom of speech. Yeah. And what I'm saying is that what we have found, the trend has been that as these manifesto, right? So what I'm asking is, have there been new protocols put in place? Because I don't want it to be set out there that, oh, manifestos can pop pop up online. We have nothing in terms of vetting, or there's no process in terms of vetting, or there's no process when it's brought to our knowledge.
Yeah, might investigate that. If we have additional information about the individual, he has this manifesto, but we know the person's out buying a gun, or we have a source inside that says this person we think is turning violent.
So there is a process.
So there is a process that the FBI is doing in any individual case to evaluate, do we have that enough evidence to predicate an investigation and open it? And we are pushing up against that line, in other words, in every case to say, okay, do we have enough? Do
it's
we not
not
have
as
enough?
though the FBI hasn't. Why don't I switch over to Mr. McGarrett, because we don't have a whole lot of time, and sort of get your take
I think if you look at some of the manifestos that we've seen more recently, last year, a lot of those manifestos will actually have intent to violence in there as well. So when we get that, that's a clue, that's a lead that we can look at and start. It's still going to come in as under a guardian to look at. There's very few things we can do, but as we build upon that and certain predications are met, we can then likely take it into.
Because I want to just sort of do a comparison between any act of violence that that you believe can be operationalized from that type of chatter, that type of material. Is that the same type of sort of intelligence that you use when one comes across these types of materials?
So if I'm looking at a threat, whether it's IT organizations, those that are designated foreign terrorist organizations, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS, that does give us more latitude, because you're actually saying, I'm going to do something for ISIS, or I'm with ISIS. That does give us more latitude to look at.
How does it give you more latitude?
They're actually designated as a terrorist organization.
So we don't designate white supremacist organizations as terrorist organizations?
So a white supremacist organization is an ideology. It's a belief.
They're not.
But it's
designated as a terrorist organization.
We don't have designated terrorist organizations
that are domestic.
Correct.
That's good to know. Mr. McGarrity, I'm concerned about the FBA not being having our organizations as domestic terrorists. What is the breakdown of FBI agents, analysts, headquarters, and analysts in the field dedicated to white supremacist, militia threats, or other forms of domestic terrorism versus forms of Islamic terror extremism?
Good question. I alluded to it before. We are set up. We've actually looked at that. Those agents in the field that work domestic terrorism, about 20%, and we have about 80% working international terrorism. But if you look at our case numbers, right? So if you look at those things that come in that we can predicate from squads in major field offices, we at least have one counterterrorism squad in every field office, 56. We have single domestic terrorism squads in the larger ones. But if you're working in a rural area, say you're in an area with 5 agents in that area, covering that area, and that threat comes in, whether it's domestic terrorism, international terrorism, public corruption, or white collar, and that's a threat, that is taking the priority. So as much as we're set up that way with cases, we're certainly set up to deal with the threats as they come in. And at headquarters, we've done how we work at our human, our source, our collection, our analysis, and our ops mirrors up between domestic terrorism operations section and our international terrorism operations section. The only difference is we also have another section that's overseas for those cases, investigations that take us extraterritorial.
Very well. You're back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. It's very important that we give someone from my office, Tim Wang, who is today's his last day, and since he's been with me, he spent every day working to help keep our country safe and keeping me ready for these hearings. So thank you, Tim, and good luck. Mr. McGarrity, I want to talk to you briefly about, you said about 80% versus 20% international domestic split as far as resources and these investigations. Is that true for the JTTFs as well?
Yeah, so the JTTFs are the components that work these cases in the field, so it would marry up. What it doesn't count is our task force officers assigned to both domestic terrorism and international. And I don't know the numbers on that, but I would assume that would line up pretty much the same as well. Okay. That's our field component.
Very fine. Thank you very much. And Mr. Murphy, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the social media component. Is the ability of the internet to unlock the latent tendencies of somewhat dormant people that are angry. They can scratch your itch by going to a certain site or talking to a certain person, and next thing you know, you go from someone with some feelings to someone with actions, and it's very, very hard to detect. I think social media companies need to be held accountable more and be more active. I know from what I've seen with cybersecurity issues, my chair, ranking member in cybersecurity, different performances based on companies. Some companies are much more diligent about it, and some people care a lot less about it. So is there anything we should or could be doing in Congress to hold those social media companies' feet to the fire more about being better stewards of what's being posted and how it's being posted?
Sir, thank you for the question. So the department continues to work with the social media companies I had brought up before. The larger social media companies seem to be...
That's whatever the motivation is, it's good that they're engaged. Some just aren't, though, you know?
We would look to continue to expand those relationships to include all social media companies if possible, and working with our partners here to educate those social media companies about the threats. And then what they do with that information, as my colleague said, it does vary from social media company to social media company.
Okay, thank you. And I want to switch gears one more time, and that is with, if you see something, say something campaigns throughout the country, considerations in it to keep firearms out of the hands of people that are about to go into a school and do a shooting, and try and find those needles in the haystacks, listen to the concerns, listen to the warnings, and then try and act upon them before they actually happen. Is a red flag concept something that might be advisable in the domestic terrorism realm?
Red flag as to training people to understand what the indicators are.
Or that they have mental health issues and they're talking about this and engage in extreme language. They're exhibiting signs that they might be ready to pop off. Is there something we can do to intervene with them and perhaps get the firearms out of their hands before they actually act?
So certainly that's a possibility. What we want to do is we want to train people to see what those indicators are. So like NCTC, the FBI, and DHS put out the indicators to mobilization of violence. It's a couple years old, but it's specific to the homegrown violent domestic terrorism threat as to these lone offenders, once they have access to a firearm, can do an attack. So what we want our schools, our teachers, our communities to know that. The bystander effect that we talk about many times, when you look back, and we've studied this on the homegrown violent extremist side and the attacker side, you look back, there's at least one person who sees that radicalization change, who sees that mobilization, likely one indicator or grievance that does.
Like San Bernardino, for example.
Yes, we want to get that. So this is what's out there. We throw that out to state locals as well as schools. But that's what we want to do, is get them to know what those indicators are and what behavior changes could be there. If someone, I'm all for, if someone can, our tips that come in, obviously 50% come from state, local, or public tips. So when I look at a state or local tip through the Joint Terrorism Task Force, many of those secondarily, collaterally, are from the local community. We've seen an increase in community tips coming in. That's a good news story from years of see something, say something, but it's also getting it out that there's likely one person who saw this or saw the change.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member. And I would just like to start by saying that I would ask every one of my colleagues on this committee to take the bold step, and I hope our other colleagues from both sides of the rhetoric, coming from either side of the aisle. That's what the public expects, and yet what we do time and time again is R's pick on D's and D's pick on R's. And they make a distinction where there is no difference. And I think that in the positions that we are in, we owe it to the public to be courageous enough to stand up and say, yes, you are from my party, but what you said is wrong. And I hope that we can do positive in nature. On April, and this question is to everyone on the panel, on April 16th, a militia group called United Constitutional Patriots was videotaped on the southern border holding migrants in their custody at gunpoint. These men were shown wearing military-style uniforms, surrounding migrants with rifles and issuing commands to stop or sit. Needless to say, this is extremely disturbing. Private citizens acting in the role of law enforcement. Shortly afterward, the leader of the group was arrested by the FBI for illegal firearms possession. We know that unauthorized militias pose a problem to law enforcement across the country, and the militia movement has resurged in the past decade. Ivan Bundy and his sons, I guess that's how you say his first name, and his sons, Eamon and Ryan, engaged in large armed standoffs with federal law enforcement officials. In 2016, 3 white men, members of a militia called the Crusaders, were arrested for a plot to bomb an apartment complex in Garden City, Kansas that was home to many Somali immigrants. To the extent possible in a public setting, could all 3 of you summarize the current domestic terrorist threat post-armed militias? And I'll just stop there and ask all 3 of you to opine if you have anything to say.
Sure. Thank you, Representative. So certainly militia extremism, the focus on paramilitary training and acquisition of weapons, food supplies, and preparation for criminal confrontations with the government is concerning. Again, though, we have the First Amendment, so if it's a militia that's training, but there's no out and investigate those that are using militias to pursue violent ends to meet their ideology or coerce the government to do something. So we've seen that. We've actually seen a decrease in militia extremism in the last couple of years, partly because we think of some of the prosecutions, notable prosecutions that we have done. So it's a slight decrease in the last couple of years.
Ma'am, we actively look out at those groups out there that are threatening both citizens as well as members of the department. So you referenced the southern border. We, as a department, receive threats from a variety of people that have certain passionate feelings about the Department of Homeland Security. We take all of that. We will immediately provide state and local law enforcement as well as the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which the department has a number of folks on that supporting the FBI's efforts. And any investigation, then I would yield back, as Mr. McGarry's already talked about.
And then just to add, from our perspective, we're prepared, working with the FBI, to prosecute those cases and other older cases. And so we work closely with the FBI in terms of pursuing charges against those cases.
Thank you. Since 2014, at least 4 mass murders leading to 45 deaths have been committed by men who have identified or sympathized with the incel movement, which is, I'm sure you're all aware, an online subculture of misogynists who blame women for their involuntary celibacy. There is often overlap between this group of misogynist extremists and other violent hate groups. John Ernest also referenced misogynist beliefs in his manifesto on the website 8chan. You've spoken at length today about working with these platforms in terms of identifying this kind of speech, but it seems to me that there have been a number of incidents where these killers have given us a roadmap very clearly. I mean, these are not, we have to figure out a way to hold them accountable and work more closely with them, because we're getting the big red flag waving and we're not able to act on that information in a timely fashion. So I'm encouraged about the work that you're doing with a lot of these, social media platforms, but obviously we have to continue to do more. Thank you all very much.
Ranking member full committee, along with a number of us, are concerned about the very same thing, and we've tried to engage the social media companies there are some challenges that we'll have to overcome, and we look forward to.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, if I may, I would strongly encourage a committee to have another hearing on this and dig deeper.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you all for being here. This is a very important subject. I'll jump right into some questions. After I was injured, I worked primarily in the intelligence community, and we have Mr. McGarity and Mr. Murphy briefly comment on what you believe to be the most deadly courses of action or possible domestic terror attacks, as well as the most likely.
I would say most deadly and most likely are both the lone offender who's self-radicalized online, who has access to a weapon.
Concur fully with Mr. McGarity's statements.
Okay, so and that is the trend we're seeing then. I mean, this is the concern. This is why we're having this hearing. There's this tendency to self-radicalize. Now, a question I have as well is, as we've effectively, not quite totally, but effectively and geographically defeated the caliphate and the ISIS caliphate in Syria, prior to this, we were seeing quite a few of these self-radicalized attacks because of their ability to radicalize people internally. Have we seen a downward trend in that specifically from ISIS in recent past because of military efforts abroad, or has it remained the same? Can we track those things?
I would say, and so what you saw from AQAP with Inspire magazine and ISIS with the social media platforms that they pushed out, you can recycle that. So if you're sitting in a basement anywhere in the U.S., you can get online and see that, and that's what's alarming. So, and we did see that. I mean, just the arrest we just did a week ago in L.A., that was a self-radicalized, but certainly on the internet, that was alarming. So from our vantage point, the homegrown violent extremist threat is certainly a priority threat for us because they're still being radicalized. It almost doesn't matter whether the caliphate's physically there or not.
Well, the content has to come from somewhere, though. Are you able to track where that content is coming?
No longer exist, and like we saw with AQAP in Yemen, you could be anywhere in the world right now and put this together. Certainly with anonymizers, the Tor, and other things, you can push that out. So geographically, it's dispersed.
You have anything to add to that before I go on to the next one?
No, sir. Thank you.
I want to talk about collection efforts. You mentioned there's more open source and more targeted collection efforts coming out of DHS and a movement away from the analysis recruitment for these jobs. Do we need to increase recruitment? How is morale among these folks?
So speaking for DHS, I mean, we have dozens and dozens of people putting in for every job, up and down our kind of tree and for the various jobs. So we're fortunate to get a large pool of talent. So we have no problem with in terms of numbers of people applying for jobs.
Okay. What about enough billets? I mean, trying to do open source analysis for such an enormous problem, which is you're trying to analyze the entire internet on who might be self-radicalized. Do you need more?
Well, sir, we're always an explanation of that, but there's always more, as you described, it can be done on the internet. I mean, it is an endless.
Yeah. On JTTFs in particular, so in my past, we worked a lot in the interagency, and in my experience, the interagency really only works because of personal relationships. The problem I always saw was that there's not an institutionalized reason to cooperate. There's not an institutionalized requirement to share information. Has that improved at all? Are there ways to improve that?
I would say from the operational side, the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, I served on the one in New York City, and I've been stationed to the CIA as a detailee. I would say right now, within the USIC...
20 years I was in the FBI and led and was a part of multiple JTTFs. I would agree with that. I know from the departmental perspective now, through the FBI's leaderships on these task force, it continues to just be, for the most part, few people I'm sure out there really well led, and it's a good process.
All right. Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chair. Now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today in your testimony. If I could, for Mr. Wagaman and Ms. McGarity, based on the testimony that you all given, and so therefore I want to talk about prioritization. Mr. Wagaman, you state that only 2 of the more than 40 National Security Division attorneys assigned to counter terrorism focus on domestic terrorism. So is this reflective of the threat?
No, just to be clear, all 40-plus attorneys in our counterterrorism section are available to work on both domestic and international terrorism matters. We don't have kind of dedicated, like, split up between domestic terrorism prosecutors and international terrorism prosecutors. We do have a domestic terrorism counsel who focuses exclusively kind of on our national program, and 2 attorneys who, all of our attorneys who are specialized in counterterrorism can work either international or domestic terrorism cases. So all 40-plus attorneys are available for both, and what they work on depends on what threats are coming in the door and what cases are coming in. So
in terms of cases that you charge 20 times as many foreign terrorist cases as domestic terrorism-related cases?
I couldn't give you an exact number on that in terms of how many we charge. You have to remember also that a lot of domestic terrorism cases are charged at the state level as well, more so than probably on the IT side, so you have to take those into account. And on the domestic terrorism side, some of them are charged as hate crimes under the Civil Rights Division, could even be a tax offense. They have tax protesters that are anti-government, so in comparing the numbers, you really would have to look across a broader spectrum.
Mr. McGarity, a November 2018 New York Times Magazine article reports that that the FBI counterterrorism agents candidly admitted that domestic terrorism is seen as a backwater, and that the only path in the FBI leadership balance international terrorism and domestic terrorism.
Well, first, let me go back to where, as far as the prioritization, from the FBI perspective, counterterrorism, preventing a counterterrorism attack in the U.S. was, still, and will be, as far as I can see, the #1 priority of the FBI. So that's still our #1 priority. We don't differentiate between a domestic terrorism attack we're trying to stop or an international terrorism attack. Source of that article was, I can tell you, the passion in the way we run our day from early in the morning to late at night through phone calls at night. No one asks whether it's domestic terrorism or international terrorism. When the threat comes in, we work the threat. I would also argue that if you look at our leaders, a good example, former Deputy Director of the FBI, Mark Giuliano, actually came in and was the Domestic Terrorism Operations Section Chief. He was in charge of domestic terrorism operations, moved into my position as the Assistant Director of Counterterrorism, moved into the Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch until he became the Deputy Director of the FBI. So I would argue whoever made that comment, maybe that was the case years ago. I can tell you it's certainly not the case now in this FBI right now, and certainly not in the case in the Counterterrorism Division.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying. Mr. McGarity, in your testimony, you referenced the fact that firearms remain a weapon of choice for domestic terrorists. Like many of my colleagues here, I believe that we need to include the use of cyber tools. Does the FBI currently evaluate domestic terrorist cyber threat actors through its responsibilities under PPD 14? And how are terrorist capabilities to conduct disruptive or destructive cyber incidents evolving?
So within the FBI, we certainly have a counterterrorism division. It's just the way we are working now. As far as a threat, I have not seen domestic terrorism using cyber per se to do an attack, but certainly if we saw it, we'd be working it like any other threat, and we'd certainly be leveraging the expertise of our cyber division.
Very good. See, my time's expired. Thank you for your testimony, and Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall.
We saw this come up multiple times. One time in my hometown of Austin, Texas, the Austin bomber. And when asked, is this an act of terrorism? It's of course it is. And it was random, and I want to commend the FBI for the great work y'all did in bringing that chapter to a close and saving lives. It was a great joint effort on the JTTF and with Austin Police. But as that unfolded, we looked at the issue of domestic terrorism, and I know as a former federal prosecutor, there's a definition. Any cases can be opened as domestic terrorism cases, but there's no charge of domestic terrorism. There's international terrorism, and we see that many times in the cases we prosecuted against ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups, but there is no charge for domestic terrorism. I think that's kind of getting to the heart of this hearing. And I was just curious what your thoughts would be on Congress enacting a domestic terrorism charge. What would be the benefits or risks of doing that? If I could just go down the panel.
Yeah, I can take that. So we're always looking to improve our authorities. And so I think we're certainly open to having a discussion with the Congress. If there's interest in the Congress in pursuing a domestic terrorism statute, we're certainly open to having that discussion. I think you have to think about exactly what issue you're trying to fix. As I've talked about in my opening testimony, we do have a number of statutes that we use in these domestic terrorism cases. So the question is, what gap would it fill exactly? We probably would not want, the one thing I would say, something that's similar to what we have on the international side, which is designating foreign terrorist organizations. we're not going to want to, for good policy reasons that I think the committee on both sides of the aisle would share, designating domestic groups as domestic terrorist organizations and picking out particular groups that you say you disagree with their views and so forth is going to be highly problematic in a way that's not when you're designating Al-Qaeda or ISIS or an international terrorist organization. So there's not going to be a precise analog on the domestic side, but that's not to say that there aren't other ways we could do, maybe analogizing to our current hate crime statutes. That would be something that we could do that would be broader on domestic terrorism.
Under a hate crime.
Kind of like hate crimes, except for focused on domestic terrorism and the definition that we have focused on domestic terrorism and the definition that we have in the code. So it's certainly a discussion that we're open to having with the Congress if there's interest.
I tend to agree. I think that's a better approach than labeling domestic terror organizations within the United States. It gets sort of problematic. Can you tell we have brought last year, for instance?
So I don't have an exact figure on that. I would imagine it's somewhere between 0 and 100, but I don't have an exact number.
Okay. And how many international terrorism cases did we bring last year?
I just don't have that handy with me either today. So unfortunately, we could try to get you that number.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is the issue the chairman and I have talked a lot about. We'd like to get to a place that, bipartisan to resolve some of this, because I think when you look at cases like the Austin bomber, it's hard for me to say that wasn't an act of terrorism. It certainly was. And so how do you go beyond just the definition, of domestic terrorism? And perhaps it's under a hate crime type law. And now, of course, in that case, I think he would have been charged with capital murder under Texas law, and that's the ultimate punishment. Hate crime doesn't have that sort of penalty provision to it.
No, it does. If death results, the death penalty is available.
So under the hate crime?
It can be, yes.
Okay.
I think Dylan Roof, for example.
Then perhaps, Mr. Chairman, that could be a way to look at this, perhaps under the hate crimes statute. I think that's a good answer. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Staten Island, New York, Mr. Rose.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for the opportunity. Mr. Murphy, you mentioned earlier the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIVCT, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So the social media companies recently came before us. Were you aware of this forum, and have you had any direct communication with this forum, and if so, how often? And that is both you as well as your office. To start with Mr. Murphy.
Sir, thank you for the question. Under the office that I manage, I don't have direct engagement with that forum. Rather, our intelligence professionals provide background information and other things to the rest of the department that does engage. So we kind of serve as that node by which.
From the FBI perspective, we're absolutely involved in that process.
But Mr. McGarry, were you aware of this actual organization, is my question.
In fact, part of that is the ACOPA process. There was a recent meeting just here in California. I was present there with members of DHS, Secretary Nielsen and others with the social media companies. I was actually at that meeting.
Great.
So yes, I'm aware of the organization. We've had at least some contact with companies that are part of the forum, the Counterterrorism Forum, and so we're aware of it and have tried to, we're working principally through the FBI to encourage them to address terrorist use of the internet.
You know, one thing that I think we're seeing here is that there isn't an instancy. Do you see any established public-private partnerships with social media? In other words, is there an institutionalized way for law enforcement to quickly and efficiently share information with social media companies or vice versa? Mr. McGarry, we'll start with you.
Well, there's absolutely a way to do it, and we do as far as sharing information. When we see threats, we will absolutely. What the social media companies are wrestling with are different countries. So you have Europol, who's looking to put forth legislation from a European Union mindset. You have the U.S. and the First Amendment, and you have other countries. So they are trying to wrestle different terms of service in different parts of the world and what that means. As they go through that. But we certainly, when we see something, we have within the Counterterrorism Division, we stood up an entire section we call strategic partnerships. That's to work with the banks, to work with the shippers, and to work with the social media companies.
Okay. Does anyone else have anything to add on that?
I would just say from under my office, as well as my knowledge of the process, we have a similar effort that we work in tandem with our partners here in terms of outreach. We work every day to try to educate them on the threats and make sure that they have the information they need to make their private company decisions off of that.
Okay. Let's talk about HN. They contacted you. Mr. McGarity, we'll start with you.
I'm not aware of specific contact between the FBI and HN, but I can follow up and see. I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm especially concerned.
I can follow up and see. I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm especially concerned about this because all of this is based off relationships. We know that much of this is happening on HN, and if we have not had any direct contact with the administrators of HN, then I'm not sure what protocols we have in place to.
Reviewing, looking at First Amendment activity. So if it's speech, if it's ideology, and it might be alarming as it is, we are prohibited from that. But our contact with HN on an operational side, if we are seeking something through judicial process or legal authority, I can get back to you on how much interaction there's been.
That'd be great. Thank you. Mr. Murphy, do you have anything to add?
Sir, I'm not aware of, I'll have to get back to you to determine whether there's been contact or not.
Thank you. And lastly, ghost guns. Ghost guns, do you view this as a threat for the future? Mr. McGarity.
Ghost guns are certainly something we've briefed up within the counterterrorism division as well as the criminal division within the FBI is something that's concerning, that you could have a weapon out there that's not traceable. Absolutely.
Right.
I would say from the department's perspective, we are trying its efforts to stay abreast of technology so that we don't have an adversary's ability to get whatever it's a ghost gun or whatever the weaponry is into infrastructure.
Fantastic. Mr. Rogren, is there anything else? All right. Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentle lady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
I made a few points I want to go back over, if you don't mind. I've heard repeatedly that this is a collaborative effort, and I know that's the case with federal agencies, local law enforcement. I visited the Fusion Center in Las Vegas. It's so good not only at trying to prevent incidences, but collaborating with the private sector. I would say that nobody does security in terms of expertise and technology better than the people in my district. The eye in the sky sees just about everything that goes on there. So I would encourage you to work with them as well, and I suspect you probably do. Going back to Mr. Katko's comments about say something, see something, say something. I know when that first came out, I think we need to maybe revisit that. I heard about a test not long ago where in Israel, they put a backpack under a seat in an airport, and within 2 minutes, somebody had seen it and reported it. They did the same thing under a seat in an airport in the U.S., and within 2 minutes, somebody had seen it and stolen it. So that's kind of what we're up against. So maybe we need a little more emphasis in this. One other thing was mentioned about the militia. I've heard the term sovereign citizens. They're an violence threat in Nevada. And in my district alone, in Clark County, there are 500 identified people who belong to this kind of movement. I just wondered if you would address them, or is it the same as militia, or do you deal with them a little differently? One other thing is, I haven't heard mentioned animal cruelty. So often when you track people who have aberrant behavior and you see them on the internet, you see those red flags that have been mentioned. And finally, one form of domestic terrorism that hasn't been addressed is against abortion clinics and abortion doctors. And that seems to have been stepped up with the president's rhetoric that's just been very inflammatory, and some outright lies. But a recent report said that providers had experienced 823 acts of trespassing, 1,700 acts of obstruction, 62 death threats, and 104 clinic blockades. Maybe you could address what y'all are doing in that area.
Environmental rights, as well as animal right type cases, those extremist cases in that category, as well as abortion rights, extremists, they are they are categories for us in our how we look at domestic terrorism. So to have that category, we absolutely are working those type cases. As far as the sovereign citizen extremist cases, obviously the harassment and targeting of law enforcement, government personnel is of concern. We do see those cases. We have a fair amount of those cases. When you look at the 850 total, a fair amount of them are sovereign citizen cases, and those are cases that certainly by differentiating themselves from the U.S. government, not abiding to the laws, certainly could become, from the numbers, certainly something we're looking at. As far as animal rights, environmental rights extremists, certainly less on that. That threat has gone down in the sense of what we saw in years past. As far as organized groups doing things, we don't see as much from some of those groups you would think about from 15, 20 years ago. But from our sense, still a priority. In fact, we just did a transfer of custody from an environmental rights subject who's been on the lam for over 15, I think almost 20 years. We tracked him around the world into South America, Central America, and we brought him back from Cuba, of all places, to stand trial in Portland. So those type cases are very important for us. And the abortion extremist cases, obviously, whenever you're looking to, on either side of that issue, when you're looking to use violence to pursue your goal, it's of interest to us. We, again, may have less of those cases, but once you get into the violence for us, you're into our realm, and that's where we're looking to disrupt you. So it doesn't matter on which side. If you're pushing violence to pursue your ideology, we're aggressively investigating you.
And very briefly, so yes, we mentioned before, it's in my written testimony, which has been submitted as well, that we're looking to build upon, and we're happy to get with your staff and yourself and give you a full briefing on it. Specific to the Las Vegas Fusion Center, we have full-time folks there. We look forward to continue supporting the Las Vegas Fusion Center and the work they're doing to look at violent behaviors, and in any way we can support that Fusion Center as a best practice. We're taking a look at that right now.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing. I wanted to go to a case that I know relatively well because it's close to my house. Attack on a Hindu mosque in my community, and then go attack a mall where I like to take my daughter to go ice skating. He was arrested. He was caught by the FBI, arrested, but then he ended up being prosecuted not by the Department of Justice, but by the Collin County District Attorney, because federal law does not allow prosecution of terrorists who are 17. And so he was actually sentenced, I believe, a few weeks ago in Collin County with a special prosecution. Obviously, it seems with the blessing of the FBI and the DOJ and their support in that prosecution. So my question, to take that specific case, which is very close to my house, I drove past Plano West High School on the way to get to work here yesterday. Taking that personal or specific example to my community, what laws are getting in the way of you prosecuting terrorists that requires the state to step?
Juveniles under the federal system can sometimes be transferred to adult status, is my understanding. And so it's really in every case we're going to evaluate in the facts of the case, whether it's a DT case or less often an IT case, whether the best means of neutralizing the threat is a state charge or a federal charge. So it could be in the case you were talking about, the decision was a discussion between the prosecutors at the state level and the federal level, and they said the state charge is actually the most effective way of dealing with this threat because they're going to get the longest sentence, or they're going to have flexibility, or based on the evidence, or whatever it might be, that the state charge is best. So that's a dialogue that occurs between state prosecutors and federal prosecutors, particularly on the domestic terrorism side. That's a frequent occurrence to have those discussions. So that's our overall approach. I don't know if that answers your question.
Sure. No, and let me just say I have a lot of confidence in the district attorney in Collin County, Judge Willis. He does a great job. He's got a great team of prosecutors there, and obviously justice was done in that case. But my broader question is, what frailties exist in federal law now that make it so that you're literally looking to the state of Texas to prosecute a case rather than the Department of Justice?
So it really depends on the facts of the case as to whether an individual case is going to be prosecutable under federal law. Not every case on the domestic terrorism side, as we've talked about, we can use gun charges, we use explosive charges, we use threat and hoax charges. We can use hate crimes. There's a whole array of charges, but there could be a fact pattern. I don't know if the case you mentioned is one of them that doesn't meet the standards for any of those cases. So it falls between the cracks, and it might be a garden variety murder case, and it's easy to prove that murder offense under state law, but it doesn't qualify for any of the other things under federal law, and so they're going to bring that as a state case.
If you don't mind looking into this and seeing what frailties there are in federal statute where we're trying to go after terrorists and then end up, instead of doing it, again, I think counterterrorism is truly a federal responsibility. I appreciate that sometime, and then circle back with my team. I would like to have a further conversation in this committee about making sure that we bring terrorists to justice at the federal level. Let me just, I have a minute left, just wanted to go into another. So hate crimes under the FBI, there was a 17% increase 2017 over 2016. I also noticed that we have 1,000 more new law enforcement agencies reporting that kind of data to the FBI. So sometimes, in an effort to be more holistic and collect more data, you increase your numbers and then people say collecting it, or is it because we're collecting more data, we have a bigger number? So it looks like there's an increase when actually there wasn't.
So from my vantage point, sir, under the counterterrorism division, I don't own the civil rights hate crimes, but I do know from hearing about it that obviously it's something we're doing more of, and more departments and their agencies are reporting it. So they want to give some time to see if there's actual increases or not due to the new data that wasn't there before. But again, that doesn't fall under the counterterrorism division where I work.
Have you gone back and relooked at these numbers and excluded the 1,000 new agencies?
So that again,
is that possible? Is that an ask?
I don't know what they're doing on the criminal side of the FBI. I do know they are cognizant of the increase and determining whether it's just an increase in the data collection and the reporting, or is there actually an increase in hate crimes. I can't answer that. I just know it's an issue they're looking at.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
This hearing, I'm going to hold this up for a second so everybody can get an idea. Mr. Murphy, are you acting undersecretary, or are you the real deal?
I am the number 2 in terms of the intelligence enterprise. The Undersecretary Galawi is in place.
But you're not acting.
I'm not acting.
No. And that makes 2 of you in the entire administration. And that personnel in your office sent several emails concerning a document referred to as the race paper. Over a year ago, racial justice organizations filed a lawsuit against DHS to release the contents of the agency's memo referred in the government documents as the race paper. Thus far, only a completely redacted memo, which I just held up, of 9 pages has been released. Understandably, we're concerned that the DHS has a document which has not seen, we have not seen, called the race paper. Can you please describe the content of the race paper and to the extent possible?
Sir, thank you for the question. I am aware of the paper that you are talking about, and we follow the Freedom of Information Act to the letter. So everything we provide goes through our privacy and Civil Liberties Office for release. With respects to, I think the paper you're holding up, I will say that it was a draft of a paper was done by a very junior individual within our organization. The nation and the project was terminated. That paper, along with a lot of other drafts that our analysts review and try to bring out, they go through a very rigorous process before we hit send on that product and put our seal on it. I would note that within the...
Well, who requested the draft?
I'm sorry, sir?
How does the draft get created?
So all of our analysts look at the various threat lines that we are monitoring and have the latitude to help explain those threats. One of the issues I brought up in the beginning of my testimony.
So there's a need for a race paper?
One of the, I don't think that the email tagline that you're referring to is the way that I would characterize that draft paper.
How would you characterize it?
I would characterize a draft paper that when it was reviewed by the first line supervisors was
copied to members of Congress?
So we will continue to follow the FOIA regulations with respects to that. With the oversight responsibilities of Congress, we were happy to go back and I'll work with staff to see what is possible.
Okay. 2 years after we've learned that the DHS had a secret document simply known as the race paper, Congress and the public still haven't seen the contents of this document. But we do know that some of the circumstances surrounding the release of the race paper, and for one thing, it was released in connection to a FOIA request related to the Black Lives Matter movement. Why would that be?
So, sir, the paper was never released.
Does the race paper include information on targeting individuals who peacefully protest against police violence or other racial injustice?
Sir, any paper that, as a professional, that I put my name on and the seal of the department goes through a rigorous process. I would also advertise that in the 17 intelligence agencies of the United States government, last year and as well as the year before, we're either number one or number two in terms of the quality of the information that the men and the women of my office put out. Part of that includes whether we reach the standards.
Okay, my time is coming to an end. Does the race paper suggest well, this thing exists to some degree, whether it was a draft or whatever it was, somebody thought to do it, but my time is coming to an end. This is very troubling. I pledge my allegiance to a flag every single day that says that we all are created equal and are allowed to be citizens, and justice is
recognizes the gentle lady from Florida, Ms. Dimmons.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this very important and timely hearing. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Murphy, I'm directing my questions to you. As a former law enforcement officer, I certainly understand the importance of timely and appropriate information sharing. How important those intelligence reports are to particularly local law enforcement in terms of helping them to be a force multiplier for law enforcement agencies having to deal with oftentimes the unknown in their community. So I, first of all, want to thank you for the work that you are doing in that area to help those on the front line be adequately prepared. But however, there does, with the good work that you are doing, there still continues to appear to be some gaps in the process. And I am particularly concerned that information regarding white nationalist gangs and violent fringe right movement groups is not being shared with state and local law enforcement, even when they specifically seek it. And I know I missed the earlier discussions about trying to balance First Amendment rights, but of course we are also trying to keep our communities safe on every day. In November, the New York Times reported that the Gainesville Police Department, which is, Gainesville is a city in Florida, was not provided relevant information leading, of course, Gainesville is a college town. It's a short drive from my district in Orlando, but a police commander with that department said that the person had 24 years of experience, so knows the job very well, described the lack of information from the FBI and DHS as the Bermuda Triangle of intelligence. So unable to receive what he thought was appropriate or relevant useful information, he went online himself and did indeed find that the violent white nationalists had who ultimately descended on the campus were not hiding. They were on social media networks, on message boards, talking about how they were going to test Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Eventually descended upon but I would like to ask you, Mr. Murphy, what are as we balance First Amendment rights, and I certainly understand what the Constitution requires us to do, what are the lessons learned for you and your department as it pertains to events like the one in Gainesville and even the one that we're all familiar with, Charlottesville? And could you talk a little bit about how the department actively collects, reviews, and shares?
In my written statements and some of the charts I provided, we basically, one of the many things we do is run what's called the Homeland Security Network, or HIS and Intel, and we have posted approximately 40,000 products on that site. They're not just DHS products, they're state and local products. They are also the products of virtually every federal agency that does work in the domestic space, and we continually improve that site. Since 2016, that site has, and the quality of products we're putting on there has increased, and we know that by measuring it in a couple of different ways. One is the metrics is that we've increased the volume by approximately 64%. We also look at how often and what actual products are reviewed. And so we've seen approximately 325% increase in the number of views. And then we ask for metrics back from, and qualitative and quantitative responses from our colleagues, which is exclusively state and local law enforcement, is do these products matter? And we see the products get upwards of about a 90% approval rating. This exists to state and local colleagues. As people change, they're coming out, they're busy. We want to make sure it's as user-friendly, and we provide it as often as we can. We've increased the number of our field.
These were lessons learned in terms of sharing of information post-Gainesville, post-Charlottesville, or were these processes in place prior to those events but somehow failed?
I would say, ma'am, that they've been ongoing since 9/11 on forward. And so we continue to learn from all information sharing experiences that we have. We've increased the number of personnel that we're deploying to the field since 2016. Again, they're not in response to specifically to the two incidences that you described, but we certainly understand the importance of deploying our personnel so they have that firsthand experience in exposing and hearing back from our state and local colleagues what they need. In response to your question, there's not a day that goes by that I challenge my entire team to make sure that any classified information reporting from other agencies, we encourage those agencies to get out that information. The last thing I'll just say to this is it's a continuing effort that we need to make. And we strive every day to push that along. We engage in virtually every state and local organizational meeting that's out there, and we look forward to continue those. I know most of the leadership on a first-name basis, and I will continue to try to make myself, and I know my boss, the Undersecretary, will, and our staff enjoys those experiences, and we learn quite a bit how we can help out our state and local colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you very much for having this most important hearing. As you know, the increase in domestic terrorism is alarming. Last year, I called. I thank you for doing this today. Gentlemen, this last week, I was back home and I held private town halls with the Jewish community and the Muslim communities in my district. Since Poway was right down the street from us, so to speak, these issues hit home for all of us. Speaking to my local school district, constituents that lived around my local high school that I attended, a lot of constituents are upset because the high school is building a fence around the school that makes it look like a prison. When I talked to the administrators, they said, Lou, this is about safety. Not only are we putting in a fence around most of our schools, we're also putting in hundreds of cameras, all of our schools. We've gotten to communities we're afraid of. And the biggest challenge is going after the lone wolves, the folks that you just can't figure out what triggers that act of hate that leads to deaths. And of course, my prayers go out to the families in Colorado that suffered in the last few hours. My question to you, gentlemen, is how are we working with the locals? In Orange County, Sheriff Barnes has a fusion center. Always says, we're doing some great job, Lou, but we need more resources. We need more resources to track the lone wolves. What is it that I hear that we're very focused on foreign terrorists and that our resources are going there, but yet when you look at the carnage in our society today, it's the domestics that are really hurting us. Those domestic terrorists are the ones that are changing our lives, how we act, how we behave, and how we invest our resources. My school district, instead of going for books and teaching, a big chunk of that money is now going to building fences, putting in cameras, and try to figure out where to put those security guards. Give me your thoughts. How do we harden our society? How do we go after these lone wolves?
So, I think you characterized the threat that in the state that we're in. I will tell you, on the domestic terrorism side, we arrest more people per year in at least the last 2 years that I've looked back than international terrorism. More people arrested that are domestic terrorism.
Foreign terrorism.
No, I mean, if you look at our case numbers, and our case numbers rely on tips from the community, our law enforcement partners, our analysis from within to see if someone is talking to someone, all those things. 50% come from the community, state, or local as far as our injects.
So does our investment, our expenditure reflect that? You talk about cases, you talk about arrests, about dollars spent. Are we spending enough on local?
I don't split the difference between international terrorism and domestic terrorism when we have agents in the field working their cases. There might be a budget line item somewhere within our books back here for travel and stuff, but it's the same. It's agents going.
I'm glad to hear that you're not splitting it based on that, but clearly there's got to be a focus on where the danger is coming from.
Well, I think you said it. The lone actor is the problem set that we're dealing with. Insular in nature, non-conspiratorial, not necessarily being directed or engaging with others. So you have lone offenders, lone actors. Very hard to detect, of course, partners to do that. But we will, time and time again, we said it here before, see something, say something. It's likely an individual, maybe a family member, more specifically, a religious leader, a teacher, that will see a change in behavior, see a triggering event where they see an individual become radicalized quickly and mobilized to violence. We need that person to speak up and tell us.
I'm out of time. One quick follow-up. Offline, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about how we continue to refocus on those specific issues, work with our local fusion centers to make sure that we're able to track down some of those folks that may blow up in our society before they blow up.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Again, Mr. Chairman, let me thank you, along with the ranking member, for this important committee. If my recollection serves me well, under your leadership, certainly as ranking member and as members of this committee, we have championed or cried out for help and relief from the growing proliferation of domestic terror. Amazing silence we've had to encounter and the loss of life. So let me first of all join Mr. Payne. I'd like to ask whoever has the document, the race paper, to release it in its entirety. I know that we do have the Black Identity Extremist Report. So let me pursue a line of question. I just need, and first of all, let me thank you, gentlemen, for your commitment to the safety and security of the American, your knowledge of the importance of a bully pulpit for good reasons. And you just have to, importance of a bully pulpit, Mr. Murphy, is it yes or no important on good comments that can be far reaching?
I believe so, yes, ma'am.
Mr. McGarity?
I don't think I understand the question.
The use of the bully pulpit for a good reason, is that a positive thing?
Yes, anyone advocating for something good, I would say is positive.
And the next witness, Mr. Murphy?
Wigman, I agree.
Thank you. And I agree as well. So let me be very clear. The President of the United States has not done enough to deal with quashing the rising acceleration of domestic terrorism and hate in this country. He has a very important responsibility. He heads the government. He gives guidance to the Department of Justice under the Attorney General, and there has not been enough done. In fact, we see in the last decade, domestic terrorism become an increasing concern in the United States. In 2018, how many were in 2015 and 2016, 70 and 72. Right-wing terrorists between 2010 and 2017 committed a third of all acts of domestic terrorism in the U.S., 92 out of 263. The ACLU and the Southern Poverty Leadership Group has indicated that hate crimes have moved up exponentially. Now, let me correct the record. I understand that previously it was indicated that the individual who did the dastardly act in Baton Rouge was a black identity extremist. I understand he was a separatist, but he's also a member of the sovereign nation. So the question is, are we still blaming and using the terminology black identity extremist? Anybody has an answer for that?
I can say from the FBI, we haven't.
Specifically to the exclusion of other hate groups. But I do believe it is important to focus on the rising emphasis of white nationalism and Nazism. They are glaringly in the limelight, starting from Dylan in Mother Emanuel, who professed that ideology, attacked or at least attempted to attack various public figures, to the gentleman professing his love for Trump in Florida, attacking members of Congress, and to Charlottesville. My question is, when is the President to emphasize to the Attorney General and to each and every one of you that your major and chief responsibility, besides all the technical things that we have to do, is dealing with white nationalism and Nazism? I'm asking all three of you that question.
I can take it, the first part, I can highlight as far as domestic terrorism, I can tell you it is
white nationalism and Nazism. Please use that terminology. I understand they're understandable.
So from the National Security Strategy for Counterterrorism this year, which was put out, obviously it highlights violent extremism such as racially motivated extremism, and then only domestic terrorism in the United States is on the rise. That's a statement, but obviously that's a strategy. What's going to be done to implement it? I can tell you the National Security Council with the National Counterterrorism Center and DHS and the FBI are now working towards an implementation plan on that strategy, as well as the rest of the United States intelligence community. So it's actually in the strategy, first time in years that I know of, that it's in domestic terrorism is actually highlighted in the strategy. As far as what we're being directed to do, like anything, we're being directed to preempt violent attacks by people who have an ideology that are trying to pursue whatever that ideology is, and that's been our mandate. That's been our mandate.
May I just make an inquiry to you, Mr. Chairman, because the other gentlemen were not able to answer. I'd like to have their answers in writing if I'm not able to hear it at this point. But I would ask the committee if we could secure a specific request. I know that Mr. Garrity have great respect for all of them. Specific request for their plan to move quickly on the issues of white nationalism and Nazism in terms of a response to those particular issues, keeping in mind everyone's right to the First Amendment. And I would appreciate if those gentlemen could either answer or they could provide it in writing to the chair.
I'm happy to answer, which is from a DOJ perspective, nationalism. If it's any other kind of threat, we're absolutely committed, working with FBI, with our colleagues at DHS, to investigate, prosecute those cases. Some of the ones you mentioned are cases that we have prosecuted, and those are mentioned in my opening testimony. So again, we're absolutely committed to addressing that threat.
Ma'am, I'm happy to answer now as well, and it's in my statements as well. We don't base how we pursue individuals who are pursuing violence or pursuing grievances solely based on ideology, that, as you noted, is First Amendment, but those that seek to harm citizens or anyone in the world based on whatever the motivation is and there's violence involved, we certainly go after that on a daily basis, and we'll continue to do that. I think our numbers in the overall domestic terrorism space bear that out. Since 2016, the amount of reporting we've put out on it has sharply increased, approximately 40%, and we look forward to working with all of our partners here to continue that reporting. I would also add that we work aggressively with the faith-based community and with our partners here to make sure where they happen to be a target, we can give them those resources they need, as well as other community coalitions that are out there. And we look forward to continuing to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member, and I thank the witnesses for appearing. Dear friends, as witnesses, if you are familiar with, and I believe you are, I just want to build the record. If you're familiar with the KKK, would you kindly extend a hand into the air? I believe lighting, if you're familiar with them, I'm sure that you know that they do. Would you kindly raise a hand? All hands are in the air for the record. And is it true that, they use this as a means of symbolizing their faith? They claim to be Christians, the members of the Klan, and in burning or lighting the cross, they are exemplifying their faith. I want you to raise your hands if you know this. Raise your hands, please. Okay, all hands. Now, have we ever have you any information wherein it has been widely said that when a Klansman commits an act of terrorism, that this was Christian terrorism? Has that ever been widely used, Christian terrorism? So it has not been widely used. We do know that if persons of the Islamic faith commit an act of terrorism, there's a commonly used term. And please, all have raised their hands. I'm putting you through this exercise because it seems to me such. We don't say Christian terrorism, but if a person who is of the Islamic faith does it, we connect the faith to the violence. I don't think that the Klan is a Christian organization. I'm the grandson of a preacher. I know that they don't live up to the tenets of Christianity. Then I don't think that that's Islam. So I'm mentioning this to let you know that we have a problem in terms of our mindset, that we have among the bigots, the racists, the Klansmen in Charlottesville. There were some very fine people among them. Would that be an appropriate thing for a member? So if the president says it, some very fine people among those who were, the president says it, is it appropriate for the president to say such a thing? It's not appropriate for the president to say what you just said would be inappropriate for a member of Congress to say. If you think it's not appropriate for the president to say there were some fine people.
Sir, if I may, at least from the DHS perspective, I think the way we look at it and the way we go after these...
Excuse me, please. I greatly appreciate your perspective, but I'm limited on time. You refuse to acknowledge that the president should not use such language?
If I could just jump in.
Yes, quickly, please.
I would say from
late now, see.
Okay, well.
You already did. You already said that it's inappropriate for members of Congress. But when it gets to the president.
I don't think I commented one way or the other. But
No, you did. You're on the record. Have to have the same standard for everyone. Same standard for the KKK, standard for the president that we have for members of Congress. If you can't uphold the same standard, you're doing your country a disservice, my friends.
Valuable testimony today. I'd like a couple of items inserted in the record in asking for hearings before this committee on domestic terrorism that on March 19th, a number of civil rights groups, NAACP, Leadership Conference, a number have requested this day. The letter has not even been acknowledged. And I think part of their interest is around this whole effort of domestic terrorism. And we want to instill confidence in interested in this issue should not be ignored. So I'd like to provide you with a copy of this letter for you to share with the director and ask him to engage those organizations who wrote him in good terrorism with him. And I'd also like to include a copy of the letter for this hearing. Without objection. Again, let me thank you for your participation. They may have additional questions for the witness, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for